The Lord give you peace. Father David Mary here. So glad to have you back for class number 21 on the life of St. Francis. And now we're speaking about Francis and the establishment of a school. So Francis was not antagonistic towards learning. That's important to know. That Francis usually put in charge of the community those who had learning. He wasn't just simply anti-learning as if he had something against the intellectual pursuits and so forth. No, he was afraid that the friars in studying would become so puffed up and so arrogant by their studies that they would lose holy minority and holy simplicity. And so Francis' sayings concerning studies was in the face of those who advocated studies with no real sympathy with the original purpose of the fraternity and looked for inspiration from the secular world. So Francis didn't want the friars to learn studies and so forth because they want to go out and live according to the worldly thoughts of things. He wanted them to take a step back and live in simplicity, live in humility, and then he was okay with the intellectual studies. He just didn't want it to be the focus of the life and to abandon the charism. Okay? St. Francis always referred to theologians and even writes in his testament that we should reverence theologians. So it wasn't like he was against theology, against learning, or so forth. Okay? And he always entrusted the order to the learned brethren, as I mentioned. He put in charge of those who had studied because they had some good knowledge there and could feed the brothers. So Francis opposed learning for learning's sake. Not learning, but fulfilling one's duty makes him strong. So it wasn't just, I want to learn because I just want to learn. Francis wanted you to learn for the sake of growing in holiness and not simply for the sake of saying, oh, well, I studied, He held little account of preaching based on book knowledge rather than on learning from prayer. So Francis didn't concern himself so much with those who could recite from books and preach from books. He was more concerned with being able to preach from an intimacy with God, because one knew God on an intimate level, and from there one would speak of God. Not simply from the intellect, but from a relationship with this God. To speak about someone he truly knew, not just about, but someone he knew personally. Okay? He said converts were not made by preachers, but by the lay brothers who are at prayer. And so Francis's objection to those who thought, well, if we study more, we'll be able to make better converts. And Francis is like, nah, the converts really aren't made by your studies. They're made by the brothers who are back home praying and doing penance for the conversion of souls. They're the ones who bring about the converts. So got to reinforce that fact that don't put your trust in what you know. Put your trust in the prayers and the penances of the brothers. What a gift that's been to the Franciscan life to have the lay brothers who do such beautiful, wonderful manual labor on the friary, that offering their sufferings and penances for the conversion of souls. And so they're sowing the seed of conversion in hearts, and the priests are going out and just reaping the harvest. They're reaping what the brothers had sown. So one reaps, another harvest. So the brothers reap and sow by their prayer and penance, and the preachers reap that harvest. Okay? So they're about the friars desiring to study. So it says in Cuthbert, wielded by the evil spirits, these brethren of mine will depart from the way of holy simplicity and most high poverty. That's how Francis addressed those who want to study for study's sake. He said, wielded by the evil spirits, these brethren of mine will depart from the way of holy simplicity and most high poverty. So you see what was causing him distress. It was that it was going to lead them to abandon simplicity and abandon poverty. And in fact, that's what happens later on in Franciscan history. And it's a sad note in our history. Okay? So directly encouraged by Brother Elias, who permitted the lay brothers to have books for study, it became very difficult. So again, Ugolino gets involved, the cardinal, Elias is able to get the cardinal on his side to oppose Francis's view. And Ugolino coming to the conclusion that it would be better for the friars to learn dogmatic theology in order to preach. So Francis wanted the friars preaching on vice and virtue, punishment and glory, calling souls to conversion, and not so much the teaching of theology in their preaching. But Ugolino figured that the church was in such need at the time, particularly against the heresies of the Albigensians and others, that would be better if the friars knew their theology better so that they can actually oppose the heretics and bring them to know the truths of the faith and bring them to conversion. So in the past, as I mentioned, friars only preached on vice and virtue, punishment and glory. They are now about to be called upon to preach doctrinal sermons in order to educate laity and refute heresy. So Francis realized, okay, Cardinal Ugolino's asking this. He saw the wisdom of that and realized, okay, we need to accede to this point. And so he turns to a friar who had just joined the order. I believe it was in 1219. So he's only been in the order for a couple of years. And he had been a canon of St. Augustine before that. He was from Portugal. And Francis had assigned him as a cook in a friary. And so Francis sends him a letter. And he says, my dear Bishop Anthony. And yes, he was writing to St. Anthony of Padua. He says, it gives me great honor to allow you to teach theology to brothers so long as you do not extinguish the spirit of prayer and devotion. That was key for Francis. And that became the foundation of Franciscan theology. This simple little letter that St. Francis of Assisi wrote to St. Anthony of Padua, giving him permission to teach theology to the brothers. So long as he does not extinguish the spirit of prayer and devotion. Prayer and devotion was to be above studies. And this becomes the foundation for Franciscan studies or Franciscan theological pursuits or the Franciscan intellectual tradition. That theology is done on our knees before the tabernacle. That theology is to lead to contemplation, contemplation to union with God. And St. Anthony of Padua, who begins the first Franciscan school of theology in Bologna, sets the stage. He is the foundation of the Franciscan school of theology, St. Anthony of Padua. And so St. Anthony takes up the role of teaching theology to the brothers. And probably during the winter of 1223 was when he went and brushed up on his theology in Vercelli in order to teach the brothers. So Anthony was a teacher of theology after Francis's own heart. He taught from the fathers of the church, and he said a man must not only read, he must work and pray. And so if a friar was given to studies, he was not exempt from manual labor. He had to continue the very same work the rest of the brothers did. Just because he was given to studies doesn't mean he's not going to work and do manual labor like the rest of the brothers, and he's going to pray. Because he needs to be able to bring that theology into his prayer and into his daily life and living in fraternity with the brothers. Unlike the Dominicans, those who go to study was not going to be excused from the communal life. Okay? He said that studies are subordinate to prayer and the life. Studies are subordinate to prayers and the life, and that's so much different from the Dominican model. For Franciscans, the studies are not above the prayer and not above our living of the life. So after all these situations that was going on with the studies, and Francis getting battered around by all these requests, the brothers pressuring him to try to lighten up the rule and so forth, Francis began to change quite a bit. He would not allow the reception of money at all, not even for the lepers. He just started putting down digging his heels in, like, no, there is no way we're going in any way, shape, or form violate the vow of poverty. We're not going anywhere near money. He no longer taught obedience based upon charity. Now he says one should be like a dead body. Thrown here, it doesn't care. Thrown there, it doesn't care. He starts changing because we're strong about his teachings about not only poverty, but also on obedience and how a friar should be obedient. Okay? Francis also began to spend more time in solitude. So the struggles going on in community life drove him into more solitude and more quiet before God. And when more news came to him about dissident friars, he would cry and lament. So there were dissident friars, even those first years of Francis's time. And when that news came to him, he cried and lamented over it. And seeing a large number of friars and their achieved popularity, one time Francis exclaimed, "Would that there were fewer friars minor, and that the world, seeing a friar minor but rarely, should wonder at their fewness." He began to realize that although the friars were reaching over 5,000 throughout the world and so forth, that there were so many that began to abandon the rule and not be observant of it and so forth. It began to cause Francis so much pain. He said, it'd probably be better if there were less of us. And the world would just wonder at our fewness. And when they'd see a friar, they would see someone who really did love the life and really living the life and was not in any way going to mitigate the living of the gospel. Okay? So Francis could have caved in and given the dissidents their way. So he could have just kind of surrendered to the dissidents. Or he could have crushed them with a certain strictness and caused division, schism within the order. You know, nothing is worse than that, schisms within the order, and we Franciscans have had plenty of them. He did neither. He set about in prayer and example in order to give the brothers a clear witness of the primitive rule. So Francis' response was not to give in to the dissidents, nor was his response to crush them. His response was, you know what? I'm just going to live the rule and lead by example, and that's basically what I can do to help here. Okay? In dread that the fraternity would abandon the rule, Francis made it clear that it was okay for the friars to set apart to return to the rule. And I'm going to read you an account of that situation. So, a German friar once came to him, Francis, with this petition. If in my days the brethren turn aside from the pure observance of the rule, as you, speaking by the Holy Spirit, has foretold, give me the command that I alone, or together with other brothers, who wish to observe the rule purely, shall draw apart from those who do not observe it. Francis listened with great joy, then blessed the brother, saying, by Christ and by me, what you ask is granted you. And placing his right hand on the other brother's head, he added, thou art a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Okay? So what you have is this one German friar who comes to Francis, is kind of like, if the friars abandon the rule, stop living it, can I depart from underneath the obedience of the superiors and begin again? And Francis said yes, and gave him his blessing. Now this story is a true event that happened in Francis's life, which is what spurred on so many Franciscan reform movements over the centuries. Oftentimes we're asked, why do the friars always split off and begin again? Why are they always having renewals? Well, because we always are in need of renewal, and because our seraphic Father St. Francis told us to do it. That when the order abandons the rule, abandons the life that Francis had given to us, we're perfectly legitimate to leave and under the obedience of those superiors and start again and begin again. Also reminds me of that compassionate words of Christ to St. Francis back when Francis was weeping and lamenting over the friars abandoning the rule. And Christ appeared to him and said, Francis, why are you crying? And Francis explained how the friars were abandoning the rule and so forth. And Christ said, Francis, this is my order. I founded it. And there will always be friars living the rule. And if they ever abandon it, one will be born to bring them back to living the rule. And if he not be born, I will make him to be born. Now get back to working out your own salvation. And so Francis was consoled that there would always be friars living the rule, and that Christ would always provide friars to live the rule radically. Okay? So we're going to move on now to the year 1223, the general chapter, and then we're going to look at the final rule, which is the rule that Francis gave us that guides the friars to this very day. Okay? So at the Pentecost chapter, June 11th of 1223, the question of a revised rule was discussed. The 1221 rule never received papal approval, mostly because it didn't vary much from the original rule, and was approved orally by Innocent III. So experts in the law knew full well that the original rule was open to adaptations and modifications. And because it never received papal authority, it is known as the Regula non Bullata. So the rule of 1221, it didn't vary much from the original rule, had all these other stuff in it, was non-canonical. They needed a rule that the Holy Father could approve to be the rule by which the friars would live their life. Okay? So the rule needed a more concise and legal form, such as the Holy See would require before approval. So it had to be a truly legal document as well as a embodiment of the charism of Francis. So the bull of September 28th, 1230, Quo Elongati, which was written by Pope Gregory IX, who was formerly Cardinal Ugolino, Francis's friend, reveals Ugolino's hand in the revision of the 1221 rule. So Cardinal Ugolino, who becomes Pope Gregory IX in 1230, writes a commentary on the rule and basically, lets us know that he had something to do with the rewriting of the rule of 1221. Okay? So Francis gave into writing the rule after the dream of bread. And so what Francis saw was, he was struggling with writing a new rule and how does he write it and so forth. And so he had this dream where he saw all these little pieces of bread, these crumbs. And he went around and he grabbed all these crumbs and he kneaded it into a loaf of bread. And the friars came and ate of the bread. And those who ate it with good hearts lived worthily. Those without it, without good hearts, who ate what were not going to really observe what they ate, they got leprosy. And so there was the wickedness of those who wouldn't receive what Francis was trying to give them. And so Francis woke up from that and said, okay, I'm going to write the rule. I'm going to take all the crumbs of the gospel that I got, all these pieces of the gospel, we knead it together, and give it to the brothers. Those who eat it with good hearts will do well, and will be healthy and fresh, and those who don't will turn to wickedness and a spiritual leprosy. Hey, that's what Francis would dreamed about it, okay? So Francis goes and takes on writing the new rule. He took Brother Leo with him and Brother Bonizio to Fonte Colombo, beautiful friary up in the mountains. And around the back of the mountain there's this cave, and Francis sat out over this beautiful area, he and Brother Leo, Brother Bonizio, and they wrote the new rule. And Francis was praying as he wrote it. He wrote it in prayer. So Francis returned to the Pozzuolo with the new rule and gave it to Elias to make it known. And Elias was to bring it to the Holy Father for approval. Now Elias did not like the new rule. He wanted something different. And so a few days later, Elias reported to St. Francis that the rule was lost. He lost it. Francis spent all that time writing it, and Elias lost it. Did he lose it? Did he misplace it? Did he drop it in a fire by accident? We don't know. We know he didn't like it, and we do know that he lost it, and we know that he'll rebel against Francis writing one similar to it. And so it's always remained the great question is what happened to that rule? Did Elias lose it, or did he burn it? It was a movie in the 80s by Mickey Rourke, stars as St. Francis, and the fellow who plays Elias takes the rule of St. Francis and says, we can say we lost it, and he tosses the rule into the fire. Could be, we don't know. Okay? So Francis returned to Fonte Colombo with Brother Leo and Brother Bonizio, and they went back to prayer, back to fasting, and Francis dictated the rule to Brother Leo, who took it down. So while he was writing the rule, Elias, with a number of ministers, came to him and protested that it would be too strict. And Francis told them if they don't like it, they could leave. And actually, there's a couple of stories to this. So Elias is there back in Assisi. All the ministers come to him and say, hey, listen, we understand Francis is writing the rule. We're afraid it's going to be too strict. We don't want this. And so Elias takes this coup with him of friars and goes to Fonte Colombo. And Francis sees them coming and he says, what do you want? And they put out their protest to make it too strict. Now, one version of the story says Francis said to them, this is the rule as Christ has given it to me. You don't like it, you can leave. Another version of the story, which I believe happened, Francis looked up to heaven and said, see, I told you they wouldn't believe. And then the voice of Christ was heard to say, Francis, this is my rule. Those who do not wish to observe it can leave. And Francis looked back and said, you heard the voice of Christ. And they all cowered away, and they remained in the order. Okay? But they still not like the rule whatsoever. They all cowered away. So in the fall of 1223, Francis himself took the rule to Rome to be approved by Cardinal Ugolino and by the Holy Father. So it's possible that Ugolino had to make a couple of changes here and there. We don't know, but it's quite probable that he did for legal purposes. Some precepts Francis wanted in the rule but aren't there. He couldn't put them in there because they weren't canonical things. For example, he wanted a chapter on devotion to the Blessed Sacrament. You know, Francis is a very Eucharistic saint. Sometimes people don't realize how devoted he was to the Eucharist, but he was. And he wanted that in there. And chapter 10, originally, Francis had the liberty to observe the rule literally, even against the wish of the superior. And it was changed to they could have recourse to the minister if they can't observe it literally, or spiritually, as it says in the rule, but spiritually and literally back then made the same thing. So Francis wanted it very clear that they had permission to observe the rule literally, even against the wish of their superior. You know, how much that would have solved things had he been allowed to keep that in there, huh? So this is called the Regula Bullata. The Regula Bullata, the rule with a bull. It was, in fact, approved. And so the rule binds the friars to absolute poverty. Patrons must distribute their goods to the poor. The friars are to be content with poor garments. They must be peaceful, humble, not judgmental. They have to work manually, not extinguishing the spirit of prayer. In necessity, they're to ask alms. They must not own any house. So the rule was solemnly approved on November 29th, 1223. Now, reaction to the rule. Elias refused to obey it, claiming that it had not made his profession by it. So Elias says, I didn't make my profession by that. I'm not observing that rule. Other ministers interpreted it loosely, causing St. Francis great anxiety. And as I mentioned earlier, Francis found great peace when our Lord told him that there would always be friars living the rule. So at the end of that year of 1223 is the memorable count of Greccio. That's probably one of the most beautiful stories we have of St. Francis. So not far from Fonte Colombo, where Francis wrote the rule, about a month later he went to Greccio, and there he was staying at the friary, and that's when he got that great inspiration to take this cave stable and to have people dressed as Our Lady, St. Joseph, and so forth and so on, and to have Christmas Mass in this Christmas Creche scene. And Francis, being a deacon of the church, preached, and every time he said the words of Babe of Bethlehem, he'd lick his lips because it was just so sweet. And this beautiful moment of Francis when he gave us the Christmas Creche became for the church something we would do year after year after year, and the putting out the Christmas creches in our parishes, in our homes, and so forth, all began in 1223 when St. Francis reenacted Christmas at that little town of Greccio at the friary, and all the townspeople showed up for this wonderful, wonderful event. One fellow even saw St. Francis reach into the empty manger and pull out the Christ child. And so anyway, it was a very, very beautiful event. One time I was able to go to the Great Christmas Spectacular in New York City, and at the end of Radio City Music Hall's Christmas Spectacular, they do a live nativity. And at the end, they say that this was first done by St. Francis of Assisi in the year 1223 in the town of Greccio. So even Radio City Music Hall gave credit to Francis for the first Christmas creche. Just another one of those beautiful gifts that the Franciscan Order has made to the church. All right, in our next episode, our next class, we're going to take up the year of 1224, and we're probably going to bring ourselves right to the death of St. Francis. And we'll be concluding our class with our next one, presumably. And so we'll catch up next time. May God bless you, and Mary keep you. Amen.